Hey guys, it's Brittany from the Different on Purpose podcast. Today we are joined by a special guest and we're going to be talking about the journey through anger and emotional vulnerability. So let's get started. For those of you who may just now be joining us, the hope for this podcast is to normalize the stigmas around personal traumas and mental health and to help people open up so they can begin the process of healing. We want to discuss our personal experiences and how we make the decision to be different from our circumstances. So take a seat and join us as we unpack some baggage. And as always, we hope that this podcast can help you make the decision to be different on purpose. Unfortunately, Jenna could not be with us today, but in her place, I am joined by my wonderful husband, Mr. Colby Horn. Hey, hun, how are you?
Good. I feel like I'm a terrible substitute teacher for Jenna, so we'll see how this goes.
Okay.
Sorry in advance for all of those who are looking forward to Jenna. A little bit more facial hair, a little bit less head hair.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How many kids you got? I mean, people know. But just tell them anyway. Tell them how wonderful it is to be married to me.
It's
What's your favorite
awesome.
TV
It's a
show?
pleasure. 12 out of 10 would recommend. Yeah, so a little bit about me. In my, I guess technically I'm probably closer to mid 30s than I am early 30s. I don't really know how that number works, but mid 30s, right? Obviously, we're married. We've been married, I guess it's technically 4 years now. It's hard to remember which one you've been married and how long you've been actually together. Been married 4 years now. Had the pleasure of seeing both of us grow, emotionally, spiritually, not physically, as well as our children,
I
obviously, in all
definitely
categories.
grew I definitely grew physically in having those children. Had to grow outward
Oh,
quite a bit.
I don't know that. Yeah, I don't. That was not what I was thinking. Yeah, I was definitely thinking in a vertical sense. You're beautiful. But yeah, so yeah, work full time. Uh, when I'm not working, I am hanging out with you and the kids because that's the only thing I do with my life anymore. My off time, I also like hanging out with you and the kids. And I guess technically I will play some video games every now and again. So that's kind of who I am in a nutshell.
Okay. Well, something that we recently started doing that I really like to do is make you really uncomfortable really quick. So, what is something that you've been struggling with lately, um, that you are working on, like, being different? So, let's say it can be something that you've been aware of recently, I guess is a better way to term it. That you're like, man, I really need to work on this. And it can be something that you've been working on for a month, a week, something you just realized today.
Well, I don't know that it would be, I don't know if I would classify it as something that I've been working on or noticed recently. But it has seemed like here as of late, my fuse is starting to get a little shorter and shorter. And so now it doesn't really take a whole lot to set me off, especially after work. I do my best at work, obviously, to not have that problem. But then as soon as I get home, it definitely seems like as of late, something has caused my fuse to get shorter and shorter. So I've tried to make sure that I stay cognizant and aware of it in the moment, which I think is the hardest part, right? Like it's really easy to get consumed with emotion or get consumed with, your point of view and kind of the persona that you envelop whenever that sort of stuff happens. And so recently I've tried to continue to be aware of those situations, right? And be able to like take a step back and be like, hey, this is an 8 year old who doesn't necessarily understand how emotions work right now. You turd, why don't you teach her how to process emotions rather than pitching a fit like a toddler? So that's something that I'm definitely trying to be more cognizant and work on. Obviously, it takes time. And I think the old saying goes, it takes two to make everything go right. So I am obviously leaning on my lovely wife to help me get out of those situations and work to be better.
Sounds like you got a winner.
I can't say anything other than chicken dinner.
All right. So we're just going to jump right into it. Can you give us a little bit of a backstory on your personal experience with anger? Like in your early life, um, what experiences do you feel like contributed to you having like an ongoing battle with anger?
Yeah, sure. So a little bit of backstory. Grew up in well, for the first 10 years of life, grew up in a two-parent household. Parents got divorced, oddly enough, 2001. So my father left us kind of cold turkey, didn't tell us nothing, just kind of disappeared. Thanksgiving of 2000, and then him and my mother got a divorce on Valentine's Day of 2001. What a lovely day that is, Valentine's Day.
Day for
Um,
unlove.
there we go, day for unlove. Unfortunately, I don't get that choice with your birthday being on Valentine's Day.
We get
So
extra love.
there we go. Just cancels out the bad and the good. It's just a positive and a negative. I think still equals a negative, but who's counting? I guess like getting older is probably a negative. So maybe it's two negatives equal a positive. I guess it's just all about perspective, right? So that happened. My mom struggled a little bit just from an emotional, financial respect, right? Of my dad not being around. My dad was very much in make money mode, and that's mostly because he had three children that he had to support. My two little brothers, one of which has a severe disability. He is mostly handicapped, right? He's got cerebral palsy or cerebral palsy, I guess, depending on how you say it. Um, Completely blind in his right eye, 95% blind in his left eye. You get the gist. But then also, my who became my stepmom was pregnant with my little sister. We are about 13 years apart. So that was a whoopsie daisies. And so he was very much in make money mode. But on top of all of that, I started to notice as I got a little bit older and a little bit older than my father, and he'll tell you now. We have these conversations because we talk about it because I try to ask him how he was able to adjust, but had some pretty savage moments and pretty big anger problems. So, as I started to get older and started to get older, I started to take on, kind of because that was my role model, right? Like, and I have spent the better part of, let's see, we're in March of 2023. So, the better part of 33 years trying to appease and please, and still to this day, even to an extent, try to get my dad's approval, right? And so I started to kind of take on his persona and started to take on the way that he handled things. I've always told people that I'm very much a happy go lucky person. I'm very positive. I look at the cup half full, which is none of that is not factual, right? Like, that as being married to me, I'm very much a positive person. I like to look at the outlook on life as like, hey, look, like it could always be worse. But deep down, that becomes kind of hard to live out when you seem that way and you act that way, but then the moment that the boat or the ship starts to rock or somebody gives an opinion that you don't like about something that you care about, so forth and so on, you start to get, when you start to get frustrated and angered quickly, people are like, hey, wait, hold on. You were, what happened? It's like someone turned you into Mr. Hyde, and I don't know how that happened, Dr. Jekyll. So started to go through that. Man, it took me a long time to realize that I had an anger issue. It really didn't kind of show itself really till I was kind of in my mid 20s. At that point, like I was kind of stuck in my ways, for lack of a better term. And it wasn't until then, circa 2013, I was poised to go into the military, right? Like I was doing really well in school. My GPA was pretty high at that point. And I say pretty high, I'm a doofus, but pretty high for my standards in the sense of it was a 3.4 at the time, 3.5, something like that. So pretty good for someone wanting to go into the military. I was doing ROTC at a local university here in Georgia, and I we went out on a field training exercise and came back, and probably, I don't know, maybe a day later. Well, the day we got back, I was like, man, there's something weird in my ear. It's like a scab. I guess it got caught in a tree limb in the middle of the night. Don't know what happened. Kind of 2 days later, I was like messing with it, and I was like, golly, this scab is huge. And then I feel like it was 2 days later, but pulled it out and there was a tick. And I was like, that's kind of a weird thing. Pink. Um, and then a couple days later, I woke up and my left eye was like stuck, for lack of a better term. And so like it wouldn't move. Like it would kind of move inward, but it definitely wasn't moving outward. And I had double vision. And so you can imagine, basically, if you want to know what that feels like, double vision, just cross your eyes. That's how it looked everywhere for me. So it was really weird. I felt like a pirate. I had to walk around like this in order to be able to do things. I was actually dumb enough to drive once or twice. long and the short of that is I got diagnosed with MS. And so completely changed my world, right? Like completely changed the way that I did things, the life that I was envisioning for myself, and the things that I want to do with my life, right? The military and all that sort of stuff, gone. Just completely the rug ripped right out from under me, right? And so it got really easy to be angry. I had a very positive outlook on life, but it wasn't fair, right? Like I was super mad all the time about the fact that like it wasn't fair. I hadn't done anything wrong. Why did this happen? And so I spent a long time being mad. But as I started to kind of, a year, 2 years, 3 years went by, I started to realize like, dude, snap out of it, man. Like it could be so much worse. Things could be like way worse than they are now. And so I've started to build this momentum, and really it kind of happened whenever we met. And it's gotten better for sure throughout the years. But I've started to build this momentum of not being so angry all the time. But it's definitely a struggle. Like, for those guys out there who, think if wonder if they're the only ones who struggle with this, you're not. I've talked to so many guys, especially like at work, we'll talk and they'll talk about how short their temper is or how short their fuse is, especially in the evenings. And I'm like, hey, me too. Me too. You want to slap hands and be mad? So yeah, it's definitely been something that I learned, right? Like it's a learned behavior in the sense of, I watched my father do it pretty much my whole life up until probably the last 5 to 10 years, which you can probably attest to. But then also just the crappy luck that I had, right? And being diagnosed with MS and like being really mad at the world and it not being fair and all this other sort of stuff. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how I have come about, I think, self-diagnosing myself with anger issues without my PhD and more so my WebMD.
So you said that you didn't really notice that you had a problem with it until like your 20s, but I'm sure with like your parents getting divorced, you probably had some anger and like not understanding that because you were still relatively young. So like either at that point in your life or even in your 20s when you started to notice it, like how do you feel like your anger manifested in your behaviors? Because like you said, you try to keep a certain perspective at work, right? Because you don't wanna, like, lose your job. Were you ever at a point where you did let your anger get the best of you and you were, like, you didn't care about losing your job, or was it how did you see it manifesting in certain behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were definitely times where I didn't care for sure. Like I would just fly off like a loose cannon, right? Like it's so funny because it's the same things that I tell people younger than me. I'm not trying to point any fingers, but it's the same thing that I tell people younger than me, right? Like when you and I have these conversations, or even when I have conversations with friends who are a little bit younger than I am, and I can hear myself talking to myself, right? I've been down these paths of having no filter, right? Like from here to here, and the anger just makes it even worse because what the anger does is it goes straight for the heart, right? Like it's people always joke, and I've heard even comedians talk about how like when women argue, like they go straight for the kill and they'll say like the meanest things. What's no different with anger issues than having a no filter attitude on top of being really angry really quickly because it can be over something stupid. And that's what always made me the most frustrated in kind of the aftermath because as you know, and this is kind of the way that I've always been, is like if I get to that point where I get angry about something stupid, it usually takes me roughly 30 to 60 seconds to then get over it. But then I feel so stupid that I even got that mad. But it is definitely manifested throughout the years. Playing sports, I would get super mad at people really quickly. Even in, relationships past, I would just get mad really quickly with both, from a romantic relationship standpoint, but then also friendships. Like I would get mad at people for stupid stuff. Simple mistakes that people would make, it would bother me and it would frustrate me, but it would be like instant. And I didn't really realize that there was like a point in time where I started to get upset about something and kind of the end result, like it was all mashed up into one space. And I know I've talked to you about like there's like this small piece of air between those two moments where I feel like I can make the decision to get really mad about something or to just kind of let it go. Right. And so it's, I'm sure, manifested in ways. I mean, again, it's been 23 years since my parents got divorced. And so I'm sure it's manifested itself in ways. And I've definitely popped off like a loose cannon in some really dumb moments. Right. And I'm 5'8" and, you know, then a buck 40 soaking wet. And so obviously I was very intimidating when I would pop off at the mouth like a 6'5" bodybuilder. So definitely learn the error of my ways as I started to become older and older. And I would say a lot of that, and this is going to sound really bass backwards, but a lot of that was me learning how to cope with things like that while going through, kind of the military training that ROTC provided. It honestly taught me to be able to like think and not just react, because reacting is what gets you killed from time to time, and thinking about things and going through the scenarios, which is also where I probably turned more analytical than emotional. It's kind of where I started to pivot from being very emotional to kind of being more analytical and thinking about things before I say or react. So yeah, I'm just a ball of anger from time to time, and I'm sure it's the ball of yarn has gotten a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller over the years. I'm just hoping that by the time that it gets really small, I'm not 85.
So you said that now as an adult, you meet people, at work or wherever, and you realize like, okay, it's not just you that's this way. You're like, you find people and you're like, oh, me too. But when you were younger, whether it was 10 or teenage or early 20s, when do you feel like you started to notice or started to feel like, I guess, your anger wasn't like everybody else? Like, whether it was true or not, I don't know. But like, when do you feel like you started to get that feeling of like, man, something's wrong with me? And, like, how did it make you feel feeling like, I guess, that you were the only one who had that sorta issue?
Sure. Yeah. So if I'm being completely honest, unfortunately, and hopefully your listeners probably feel this way about listening to you and Jenna talk about these sorts of things as I do, but for the fellas out there, it's not abnormal, right? Like the anger that I had wasn't abnormal. Like you've met some of my friends, you've met actually all three of my friends. So you know that it wasn't necessarily something that was like. We played a lot of video games when I was a teenager, right? And like we would all get mad. We all hated losing. We all hated not being the best. And so like it was just kind of normal. And that's where it manifested itself. When I was in my, I don't know, call it early teens to maybe late teens, that's kind of how it manifested. And so it didn't seem abnormal. And then going from that, kind of transitioning, and again, I still had the same friends the whole time. And so kind of transitioning into college and being in kind of a military program, well, there was a lot of guys there with anger issues, right? And so honestly, it didn't ever jump out to me that it was abnormal. It really wasn't, again, until I was in my mid 20s and I was away from all of that. And I started to have normal functioning relationships with people, that I started realizing like, wow, like this can't be healthy, right? You get on social media and you listen to people talk about, anger issues and anxiety and depression and all those sorts of things that they feel, and you're like, oh wow, maybe this is what's been going on this whole time. Maybe I do have a problem, right? And again, I guess I guess I should say that I probably noticed it in my probably early-ish 20s, really early 20s. The only way that I noticed it though was because my dad was a very loose cannon and like would fly off and get mad about stuff. And so I was always like, you and I have talked about this, right? Like we have that I can't remember the word, but it's I want to be as far away from my parents as possible, right? Like I don't want to be that way.
Mhm.
And so I always pretended like I wasn't that way, but then deep down I knew. I was like, "Ooh, man, I'm a lot more like my dad." And both the good and the bad, right? A lot more like my dad than I wanted to admit. And so like I would keep trying to run away. And every time I would run away, I would just circle back around to it whenever something happened. And so I don't know that I ever noticed that it was a problem until I got to this age. And then it's like, man, I'm still kind of having a problem with this. And again, in my mid 30s, is there anybody else out there? Have people conquered this? Like what in the Sam Hill is going on? I don't swear. So what in the world's going on? Like I don't. And that's, I guess, another crazy thing is I don't swear. And so people always wonder, like, well, what do you do when you get mad? And you say dumb things. And I'm like, yeah, honestly, it's just like, oh, biscuits. I'll just make up silly words to say whenever I get mad, which is part of that is tactical, right? Like when you start to swear, it kind of hypes you up or makes the situation worse or makes you more mad. Whereas I feel like since I don't swear, it kind of de-escalates situations, and it's like, oh, that's silly. Like at least that's what I like to tell myself. Who knows if that's actually true?
So, do you think that, any of your I wanna say that your parents getting divorced because I know, like, kind of way more details, than we're gonna go into here, obviously, but do you think that your parents' divorce what I mean, I'm gonna say I know it was traumatic for you. It may not have felt it at the time, but it would be traumatic for, any kid to just wake up on Thanksgiving and their parent be gone. So with that trauma, do you think that that really fueled some of your anger issues? Like, what do you think the connection there may have been? Like, I understand you said it was normal as, like, teens, you and your friends, you get mad playing video games and stuff, but was there ever a point where you felt like when you were going through what you were going through, that you were a little bit more on edge? Like, do you feel like there was a connection?
Hard to say. I'm sure there was. I'm sure there were certain traumas in my life. I can definitely remember vividly some of those traumas, right? And so a lot of those being again in those moments of anger between my parents, like I can remember them just having shouting and screaming and cussing matches, like in the aftermath of the divorce and like when my mom would drop us off and so forth and so on. So I remember those. I remember arguments, not really arguments because I was young and my dad was not young and there it wasn't an argument, right? But getting disciplined as a child and like him literally scaring me and thinking like this is the day that he kills me. Which again, I know now looking back, I'm like he would have never done that because I understand like there's a lot of stress in being a single parent, right? Like there's a lot of stress in having to provide for multiple people, multiple children on top of multiple adults, and so it can get stressful. And so I've definitely been able to kind of understand how stressful that can be in those moments. So I don't know that I can point to anything specific. I'm sure it's a culmination of many a thing, right? And unfortunately, as most men, and again, I will speak stereotypically, as I've never talked to anyone about it. I've never talked to a therapist. I've never talked to a counselor. I've never talked to really anyone about it. Mostly because pride, right? Like you think, oh, like I can figure this out myself. And I would just say for any guys out there, like I know it seems like you can figure it out yourself, but there are so many good resources out there for you to take the time to just like break down those barriers and really make true monumental changes. And I say that semi hypocritical because again, I've never spoke to anyone, but I do think that it's something that I'm looking into and starting to go down that path because I understand like, hey, I can't do this alone. Like we weren't meant to do this alone. That's not how we were created. We shouldn't be having to walk down these paths alone. And so, it's tough to point to something specifically. Again, culmination of events, a lot of things that went on in my childhood. And it's crazy because I don't really think I had a terrible childhood. I didn't come from alcoholic parents or parents that abused me, right? Like it wasn't physical abuse. I definitely, and my father agrees to this day, of his children, I was the one who called it the absolute worst. There was a super high bar and expectation that was set for me being the firstborn. It was just natural for that to happen. And so I definitely caught the short end of the stick on most of the ways that I was disciplined from an emotional and a verbal standpoint. But all in all, like it wasn't a terrible childhood, kind of middle class ish. And so that's why I say sometimes it's hard for me to be like, to point to things like, oh, well, it was traumatic. Cause then I'm like, and there are some things that happen to people that are way more traumatic than mine. And it's not to play down what happened to me, but it's also to try to keep it in perspective and compare it to things that have happened to other people. So, I mean, what do you think? How do you from the wife of a person with anger issues, what sort of things have you noticed, right? Like what are the things that you've noticed that, again as a wife, how do you react? What does it look like to you when those moments happen? Is it instant? Do you feel like there's time? Does it boil? Like, is there anything that you think specifically triggers it? Just again, for people to understand being married to someone, seeing the trials and tribulations that they go through.
Um, so I feel like I can view your question in two different ways. So I can see how it affects you sometimes. I don't know if that's what you were really asking is like do I know what triggers you? Um, or if how you act, how that affects us or triggers us. I
Yes.
don't really know. Okay. So, I think that there's really only ever been one time in our relationship where you've, like, really lost your temper, kinda like your dad's level, kinda like, and that was very early in our relationship, and I think that in that moment, like, me saying, like, I will like, I'm not going to put up with that. Like, I've been through a lot in life, and, like, I know that there's nothing that can happen, like, the dishes can't be dirty enough, the I don't remember what the argument was about now, but, like, I can't say anything, I can't do anything. I don't feel like there's ever a situation, I guess, in which I would think that losing your temper at that level would be appropriate. And so I think bringing that to your attention in that moment, like, hey, this is not okay under any circumstance. Like, I don't care if I ran over your dog. This reaction is just unnecessary. Like, I think that kind of put it into perspective for you in that moment. And like, it's literally never happened again. Now, there are times like we've had disagreements, you've gotten upset, you've gotten whatever, but like, and vice versa. Like, I have too. And so, um, but I think that I've only experienced it like on a very high level the one time. And I don't think that it took much except for somebody to tell you, like, "I'm not gonna put up with that," for you to kinda, like, be like, "Yeah, there's no excuse for me to get, like,
Yeah,
that
I
mad."
mean, I definitely agree. Like, I think sometimes it's hard, right? Like, it's no different. I've heard Jenna talk about anxiety and like the panic episodes that happen, right? And you've talked about it before with your depression and your anxiety of how they've talked to you about grounding.
Mhm.
And so I think for me, and I can't speak for everyone who has those issues or has these issues about having really bad anger problems, but I will say that that sort of grounding, right? Like, hey, under no circumstances is that okay. I know it sounds like you're talking to a child, but honestly, like saying those sorts of things, and it's like, oh wow, I really flew off the deep end on that, and that was like completely unjustifiable. Again, now granted, hitting a dog was a bad example because you know how I feel, uh, but for sure, right? Like the instances where that has happened has been the one time, and again, to caveat, you've seen my dad get that way a couple times
No,
in
yeah,
our
yeah.
relationship, and so you know what when I speak about this, you know specifically the instances in which what it was like as a child, right? It's no
Yeah.
different than it was then. Now, again, it's been a long time since that sort of stuff has happened, but that's the sort of stuff that my life was about, and so that's what I grew up with thinking was normal, right? And so that's how I've kind of approached relationships. And I think that to have that, like you being able to see it is, and I know we had the conversation directly after the very first time it happened. And I was like, see, yeah, I don't ever want to get to that point. And then
Mhm.
you saying, hey, there's no reason to ever act like that made me realize, like, oh crap. I just did it. I did exactly what I never wanted to do, which is to fly off the handle kind of ridiculously. Again, I'm sure it was over something stupid because that's normally how it works. But seeing and hearing that and remembering, I think, is what pushed me across the finish line, right? Like, I told myself I was never going to be that way. I did it. And so I'm never going back down that path again. Like, I don't ever want anyone to feel that way. I don't want myself, right? Selfishly, I don't ever want to feel that way again. I don't want to be that mad because that's the other thing too. That's the frustrating part is I know how bad stress is on your body. I know I'm very like health conscious. And so I keep all that stuff in mind. But then when that happens, I'm like, oh, I probably just took 27 minutes off my life. This is silly. So yeah, I mean, I totally agree that I think it took that one time and not took to say that, you know, it was good, right? But also it took just one time for me to be like, "Hey, stupid, you are going down the wrong path. Need you to
Yeah, and
hang a
I
left
think
up here and then come back to me."
yeah, and I think that, it really is that way sometimes because I know it with my personal issues of, like, my sucky communication, like, I didn't grow up having any good example of communication and whatnot, and there's a whole grocery list of other issues, but the, um, the anger
Give
that
yourself
you
more
were
credit than that. It's a scroll, not a grocery
okay.
list. Just
The
kidding.
the example that was set for you was that reacting that way, even over stupid stuff, was normal. And so I think that it did somewhat take having somebody else, a different perspective in your life that was, somebody that you really cared about to be like, look, this isn't okay for you to be like, there are other options. There are other ways to react. I know you had kind of started your journey of growth before we met, but I think that since being together, and I can say this for myself as well, like since being together, I think that you've grown a lot more in the last 6 or so years than, you I don't know, I would assume maybe more than you would have, obviously, because if we hadn't have met, like, you might be 33 with no kids. And I think that, like, having kids and having a spouse, to hold you accountable and all those sorts of stuff, like, having those relationships where it's not just easy to just be like, "Oh, okay, like, you pissed me off, so I'm just gonna walk away," 'cause, you have a legal binding contract of, like, whatever, and you share finances, and you have a house, and if divorce was that easy, everybody would do it, but
Objection, Your Honor. Overruled. You signed up.
yeah, so I think that, having that different perspective, was kind of one of those, like, eye-opening experiences for you, just like, I've had some of those with you and telling when you give me your older advice on, like, the way I can or, shouldn't react to stuff. Sometimes it takes you just telling me that to be like, "Oh, yeah, you're right. I screwed up." So, what would you say did I answer your question? Really? And,
Yeah.
like, what it was like for me? Okay. I was like, I don't know if I really went into much more than just the one incident.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Oh,
I think so. I don't think. I mean, again, I think also to your point, and you fast forwarded my growth. Well, part of the reason that you fast forwarded my growth was just because A, you just loved me for who I was. It's the right answer. B, Everly, right?
mhm.
Right. I realized very quickly that children are sponges. And so, and especially even with Declan now, like seeing sometimes whenever he reacts to stuff and he gets angry, I'm like, oh my gosh, have I caused that? And I've even had a conversation with people at work and they tell me, and they're like, I freak out because I'm like, oh crap, is that just me as a reflection? And now I'm like, oh man, I hope I haven't already started a bad habit of anger issues because Lord, I know how this works. So, yeah, I definitely think it fast forwarded for sure with you and Ev coming around.
Okay. So in your opinion, with all of that being said, what would you say, um, differentiates healthy versus unhealthy expressions of anger? Like, what would you, um I guess if you can, like, give some examples. Tell me what you think the different like, what differentiates them, and then give me some examples of, like, I guess, times in your life where you've experienced some unhealthy behavior, and then, like, what the consequences of those have been. Like, not just you
Yeah.
realizing that it's been bad, but, like, kind of have there ever been situations in which you've experienced actual consequences for exhibiting some unhealthy behaviors?
Yeah, for sure. So they're definitely so the Bible talks about be slow to anger, right? And so I think that there's kind of a line where you can draw if it's like instant anger, then there's a problem. If it's something where something continuously wrong happens and you get bothered by it, bothered by it, bothered by it, and then you get angry, maybe justifiable. I also think it's situation based, right? Like it's easy to justify. Like in the moment, whenever you are getting angry or upset about something, it's really easy to justify it and just point to all the things that were going wrong. But that doesn't make what you did any more right. And I know you and Jenna talked about this kind of about in apologizing, right? And it's no different kind of in these moments when you start to get angry about something just because the person across from you or next to you or driving slow in the left-hand lane did something to you. That doesn't necessarily mean that anger should be the first emotion and getting mad or getting upset should be the first emotion, right? Like, and I say that to also caveat with it's okay to have feelings and it's okay to have emotions and get upset about stuff. And if somebody says something that angers you, that's okay. It's how you express it, and I think that's where the line can be drawn. You can tell somebody, and this is something that I've learned and I've actually started to get better at is you can tell somebody, "Hey, dude, that was so unnecessary." You don't have to say that like, "I didn't I didn't do anything to cause you to be that way," or "If I did, that was not my intention," right? Like, you can take ownership and accountability for making someone get angry, that again doesn't justify how they reacted. And I think the way that you express your anger is the way that where the line is drawn between healthy and unhealthy, right? Like for example, conflicts at work are really easy to pick on. So a conflict at work, if someone says something to you or spouts off at you or is like, no, you made that mistake. That was your fault. The easy thing to do would be like, no, 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 I didn't do it, even if you did it. Or don't come at me with that attitude. Like that's the unhealthy way, right? Like that's the way to not get anything accomplished, because I think that's the other problem here too is when you start to get angry, you don't get anything accomplished. Nothing comes of it, right? You're just mad and you just again stressed out and upset for no reason. So I think expressing it in unhealthy ways, again, swearing at people, degrading people, demeaning people, getting physically violent. And I don't necessarily mean with people, but there have been times where I have punched holes in walls because I've been so frustrated over stupid stuff. And so that's unhealthy, right? Like there's many a time, there's where my father lives now, there's a hole in the wall made by yours truly because I got mad about something stupid, I'm sure. Again, to the point that you made when we got into that argument, nothing is ever worth getting that mad. So when you start punching holes in walls and windshields and breaking stuff and throwing things, like that is extremely unhealthy. And again, there have been unfortunate, and I hate to admit this, but there have been times where I've gotten that way. Even in our relationship, I have gotten that way. Um, with no intent to ever be physically violent towards anyone, but just more, I need to just take this frustration out on something or I'm going to explode. Oh, there's a wall. That seems like a good idea. Wham. Right. So I think it's just the way that you express that anger. And I think it's a fine line between internalizing, right? Because what you don't want to do is internalize it all and then you explode because the milkman was late to deliver your milk. That doesn't happen anymore, obviously, but we'll call it the Amazon man. He's the new milkman. So there's the difference between exploding on the Amazon man and in like just ingesting all that, or just ingesting it in the moment and then talking it out, whether it's talking it out with someone who's completely not, has no part in the story, with someone in it, or by yourself. Honestly, that's how I solve most problems. And I know it sounds like I'm a nut, but that's how I solve a lot of my problems. It's like I talk it out. And if there's no one around to talk it out with, I'll talk it out with myself and I'll be like, all right, was it really necessary to get mad about this? No, probably not. I mean, yeah, I probably just took it out of context and it's probably just due to something else. Right. And then that's the extent. And I have let it out. Right. I've ingested it, but I've let it back out. Right. And so I think the next step in that is letting it go. And that's the hardest part, is letting it go and not letting it affect your next conversation with that person or your next conversation with any person. Right. And not holding on to that grudge. I think that really the ultimately it just comes down to the way that you express that anger. And I think that the more that you can start to control that expression and start to like put parameters on that expression, again, we all walk down this road of life and that road is curvy and it goes over bumps and it goes out this way and then it'll come back and eventually you'll start to go straight again. And so there's going to be times where you kind of go off the path and you get upset about something kind of overly, because we're all human and we do that. But I think being able to reconcile and be able to move back forward to the path and be like, okay, the next time this situation comes up, I know what to be ready for. Again, it all just, I think, comes down to a matter of expression.
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, I know you didn't ask me, but I'm gonna give it to you anyway.
Hey,
I
honey,
think
what would your opinion be?
I think that, the biggest thing that differentiates whether or not you're, and I think you kinda touched on this, but then you went left. Like, I thought this is where you were going, so I was gonna be like, "Oh, I don't even have to say it." But I think that the biggest differentiator for me, is differentiator a word?
It is
For
a word.
me,
Yep. You can check that one off.
is, whether or not the way you're expressing your frustration is going to lead to a solution. Because if you're expressing it, like you said, and you're cussing at people, you're degrading people, this and that, like obviously you're not going to get to a resolution of any sort. Your relationship's not going to be in a good place. Your
Yeah,
they're
you're
trying
not
to solve
looking
an
for a
issue.
solution at that point, right? Like,
Yeah.
you're just being emotional and you're retaliating, and I think
Mhm.
that's the word, right? It's a retaliation, and it's not a resolution, and I think
Yeah.
that's really a big fork in the road that you decide to retaliate or you decide to resoluteate. That's not a word. But
Yeah, but like you were saying, if you're talking to somebody, you can still express your frustration and be like, "Look, what you did was not okay. I would appreciate if you never spoke to me like that again or XYZ." You can talk to somebody and express your frustration and say, you know, "I didn't like what you said to me, but at the end of the day, like, we need to figure out what's gonna work in this situation for the both of us." Or if it's a problem at work, you need to be like, "I didn't appreciate the way you spoke to me, but, you know, we still have to work as a team to come up with, a presentation or, whatever the case may be." So I think if you're expressing it in a sense of like setting your boundaries, but also working towards a solution or a resolution for your relationship, your friendship, whatever, um, then it's in my opinion deemed a healthy expression. But if you're like you said, you're just being a jerk just to be a jerk, then like when you yell at people on the road who can't even hear you, um, then it's
I don't know what you're talking about,
I'm just like, that's a little unnecessary. 'Cause they can't hear anything you're saying. I
for
know for
sure.
you, you're like, "Well, I'm getting it out," but, um, yeah, I
For me
just
now, it's the look. It's the trying to say less words and do more of the looking. Even then, I probably should cut out the look. I've definitely gotten better, I think, as time
Yeah.
has progressed with the road rage
Yeah.
part. But again, I think, hey, you just nod your head and agree. I definitely think too, just on the vulnerable piece of this part, right? Like the vulnerability to say, I have a problem. I get mad really easily and I need to figure out a way to fix that sort of stuff. It's identifying in these moments of conflict, frustration, that's where it becomes vulnerable and you start to become you almost start to feel what's like I guess to liken it to what you have said, you feel like you're outside your body trying to tell yourself, "Hey man, like this is the moment that you need to be vulnerable and you need to not get mad. You don't need to like close up and just retaliate, right? And say the first thing that comes to your mind or say something that you know is going to upset them or whatever the case may be, go into resolution mode. And I think that's where the vulnerability lies with anger issues is not necessarily telling people like, hey, I'm a hothead and I got a bad temper and my fuse is this big. Yeah, I don't think that's the vulnerability part. I think the vulnerability comes into play whenever it's go time and the lights are on and there's a conflict and you've got to figure out and not a conflict that you're watching other people have because that's easy. You can just come in and be like, hey, here's what the resolution should be. It's you doing that in the moment with a conflict or both externally and internally, like, right? Like having an internal conflict with the way that something's going on, being in that moment and being able to come up with a resolution and put your emotions and feelings aside and using the term, leaving them at the door and being able to come up with a solution. I think that's where the vulnerability lies. And that's where you can say, hey, look, what you did made me upset. I don't want to come off as emotional. So I want us to talk this out to be able to come up with a resolution on how we fix this problem.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I think another side of, the vulnerability aspect is also when you do mess up and you do fly off the rails. I mean, not like punching walls and stuff, but like when you do, get a little elevated or maybe do something, say something that is going to, hurt somebody's feelings and you're doing it on purpose. Um, I think that when you do that, it's also very vulnerable to be like, that was wrong of me. I shouldn't have done that. And like kind of how Jenna and I discussed and how you and I have discussed plenty of times, like going back and apologizing. And like we told Everly, a few weeks ago, like just because you're apologizing for the way you reacted, it doesn't make whatever I did that upset you right. Because I'm still wrong in whatever I must have done to upset you. But also, you can apologize for like your part in the way you reacted. And I think that's a big part is, and that's not something I grew up with. And I know it's not something you grew up with. It's not something a lot of people grow up with where their parents are okay with showing their children that they messed up. Like my mom was always like, she would, she would die on that hill. Whatever the hill was, everybody around us could be like, Kim, that was wrong. And she would be like, I don't care. No, it wasn't. Like, she was wrong. And so I think that we both have been very conscious of that and doing a good job in setting that example for our kids, whether it's involving them or not. Like, we've had disagreements in front of them, and I think we both feel that it's very important for them to witness disagreements, like, smaller disagreements and whatnot, so that they know conflict is normal in life, but then also very important to see us, resolve it.
Totally agree. You know how I feel about apologizing in the moment. I think it takes a lot of gumption to apologize in the moment and say, "Hey, while I'm still emotional and while I still feel all these things, I want to let you know that I'm sorry for what part I played in getting it to that point." Right. So, yeah, totally agree.
Um, so I know you've talked about recognizing within yourself when you're getting to that point, when you're getting too frustrated, when you're, possibly overreacting, etc. But let's say you're not at a point where you can recognize it until after the fact. Like, let's say you're not at a point where you can recognize it in the moment and stop it. How would you say, because I know this is something that you and I still kind of are trying to figure out, and a lot of times it is on a situational basis, but what would you say, or what advice would you give for spouses or friends or family members, whoever, when they notice somebody that they care about getting to that point? Like, how do you point it out to somebody without making them even more mad?
Put on your tennis shoes and run. Run as fast as you can. Just I want you to lace them up, make sure they're on the right feet, and I just want you to take off and run far away from that ticking time bomb. No. Um, I think the biggest thing, and again, as you noted, we've talked about this at length, is the best thing that you can do as a spouse, as a friend, as someone who cares about that person, is work your butt off to de-escalate the situation and get them to realize, hey, it's okay. Like, if I said something to you to irk you, I'm sorry. That was not my intention. Right. And it's not, people confuse this with walking on eggshells. And I don't necessarily know that it's walking on eggshells. Right. Like, in that moment, it is hard. It is super hard to take accountability and responsibility for something that you may not have done in a moment. And I'm speaking as the spouse or the friend or whomever. It's hard to be like, well, I mean, I didn't do anything wrong, Mr., for lack of a better term, pissy pants here, just in a bad mood. It's easy to do that, right? It's much harder to be, what can I do to like get them out of this? What can I do to help them? What can I say? How can I de-escalate their mood or whatever the case may be, right? And you do a good job of this, of just being like, hey, it's okay, it's fine. Spilt milk, it'll be okay. And again, 95% of the time, that's me. I feel like I do those things naturally. It's okay. It's not a big deal. And you can take the way that you act and that be a normal way, but then in these moments, it's for whatever reason it doesn't click, and you're like, oh man, like I've started to fly off the rails, right? So I think the biggest thing is de-escalation, working with that person to de-escalate the situation, to de-escalate how they feel, not to belittle them and say, dude, it's not a big deal, which is something that I have to work on. I know when I'm de-escalating how you feel, is to stop using phrases like it's not a big deal, because it's not it's not to our discretion to say what's a big deal and what's not, but more so just comfort in, hey, it's going to be okay. It'll be fine. We will get through it. I almost said it's not a big deal. We will get through it. We will figure, something,
Yeah, like
even
showing
something silly.
empathy.
Yeah,
Even
right. So even
Yeah, even if
something,
you
if
don't, like, feel it, I feel like you can fake it till you make it, right?
for sure. Well, I mean, and it's not even necessarily faking it, right? Because we all go through these moments. It's different. People with anger issues, we go through these moments a lot more. Like, even you, as someone with not having anger issues, like, you have these moments where you get mad about something really quickly. And so the empathy can be real. I definitely agree. Sometimes you will have to fake it because you're like, do nothing to this big old meanie head. So I know that that's sometimes the perspective that has to be taken. But ultimately, it just boils down to being able to help de-escalate how they feel and to just give them a moment to just decompress, breathe it out. I mean, even for me, sometimes I'll be like, "Hey, you're in a bad mood, dude. Cut it out." And I'll tell myself that, and I recognize it in the moment, but it still takes me a second to like snap out of it, right? And even then, it's not a all the way snap out of it. It's just I'm cognizant of what's going on. I want to let you. And we've had this conversation as you know, close to now as yesterday. I don't know the term I was looking for. As recently as yesterday, we had this where I was like, "Hey, I don't know what's wrong. Something's just off, and I feel irked, and so I just want to let you know you haven't done anything. Sorry if I'm being a turd waffle." So I think it's just in that moment being able to help de-escalate the situation
Yeah, I agree. I think just being conscious, even if you don't know how to de-escalate, because there have been times where, with you and I, but both ways, where we're like, dude, I feel like I've tried everything and nothing is working. So there's sometimes where, it may just be better to not say anything, or at least when you are talking to them, being conscious of what you're saying.
for sure.
Um, and so I think that remembering when somebody you care about is in that state, they're not really themselves. Like you were talking about this earlier, but like their brain is literally in like a fight or flight state when they're that angry. And so they're just they're not thinking rationally, they're just
Ready to
saying stuff.
fight everyone.
Yeah. I was going to say fight or flight, but really it's fight, but if you're dealing with anger issues, I guess.
Yeah,
So, their brain is not in a state to where they're going to think logically. So sometimes even if you're trying to de-escalate, whatever you're saying to them to try and help bring them back down may not really be registering. So sometimes it's better to just be like, okay, I'm sorry if I did anything. If you want to talk, just let me know, and then just kind of give them space, or, just I know with you sometimes if I just like scratch the back of your head, rub your
that's
back a
all it
little
takes for
bit,
me. I don't.
I don't even
All of us, all of us males with anger issues will cower at the touch of a woman's hand on the back of your head. I don't know what it is. It's definitely a de-escalation. It's like a cat. I'm just on a purr every time it happens. I'm like, I'm better. I'm a kitty.
Okay, so what would you say are some practical techniques that you found for managing your anger over the years? I know you talked about grounding a little bit. What are some other things? Do you like, take a walk? Drive in your car? I know you said you used to punch walls. Please don't punch walls in our new
No,
house.
not gonna do that. So the Navy SEALs call it tactical breathing. It's in situations where you start to feel overwhelmed, you start to become really conscious and focused on your breathing. So I've definitely tried to implement that over the years. There are times where I forget to do that, but when I remember to do it, it's very much a and it's almost for me, my tactical breathing is as I suck all the bad air in, I blow it all back out. Bad air, blow it all back out. And then eventually I'm blowing all the bad air out. And I'm like, okay, not that big a deal. Get it all out of my system. Blow it all out of my system. And so that is one thing that I've definitely implemented is using that tactical breathing. And I know people are like, oh, breathe and hold your breath and count to 10 and count the spots on the wall. I don't know. Grounding, I think, is one. I think breathing is another, but also finding your thing, whatever that thing is, right? For me, it is listening to music or it is playing video games, right? Like that's how I de-stress overall. And so in moments where I feel like I'm starting to get to that point, I will take the time to do that. And it may be kind of inconvenient, right? But I will take the time to do that. I will go upstairs and start cleaning, which is what every psychopath does. I'll go upstairs and start cleaning, and then I'll play a song, and I will feel better after a couple of minutes. And again, sometimes it's inconvenient. I may get up from the dinner table, right, and go do this if I'm frustrated about something. But again, in a few moments, you're able to kind of find your center and find your zen again, for lack of a better term. Be able to kind of come back down in the moment, be like, I am one with my inner self and I am back to normal. Tickle, tickle, tickle. So I definitely think finding your thing, breathing, grounding, those are all things that I know I have done to be able to be in the moment.
Again, I know you didn't ask, but my things are definitely, reading books and going to Target, so
You
just
already you don't have to public service announcement again, guys. I just for all of the guys out here that are listening to this podcast, those are every woman's things. Take her to Target, feed her, and then let her read on her brand new Kindle, and she will be totally fine. You will be a winner, chicken dinner every single time. You heard it here first. You're welcome for the TED Talk.
I don't know if every woman enjoys reading. A lot of women do. Some people
Every woman enjoys Target, I'll tell you that.
yes,
You
that
ever
one,
met one that didn't?
Um, okay, so, I know that, anger issues and being vulnerable as a man, that probably more than anything, um, is an ongoing issue. I know a lot of it's been drilled into so many men, um, that showing emotion is a sign of weakness, and so you just gotta be rough and tough and hold it all in, and, the only emotion you are allowed to show is anger, and you're ready to beat somebody's AWS. I'm gonna take a note from your book. I'm not gonna cuss in this podcast. If it was Jenna, maybe. But, yeah, so, I think that it's especially with all these older generations. I know with Declan, like, I even fight it sometimes. Like, earlier, he was crying about everything, and I was like, "Dude, can you just dry it up?" But then I'm like in my brain, I'm like, "Don't tell him that. Let him cry. Let him have emotions. Emotions are normal." So, I get onto myself a lot for it because I grew up with 2 brothers, and I grew up watching, I had a lot of guy friends in high school, and all guys that I've ever known, like, I just feel like they have this, "I can't I can't shed a tear," kind of mentality,
I
and
like to
so
refer to it as a macho mentality.
yeah,
The
macho,
M&Ms.
yeah. So, I think that this is an ongoing battle. I think that or I'm hoping that with, each kinda new generation that it gets a little bit better, um, and that men can eventually get to a point where they are okay being vulnerable, they're okay talking about their feelings, and then maybe we won't see so many feelings being manifested as anger. And then, so many people won't be, I guess, dealing with quote unquote anger issues. Um, I just think it's something they've been programmed to do. So I encourage any man that's listening to this podcast or anybody else that's listening to this podcast that knows a man that may benefit from it, obviously sharing it with them. But um, if you're struggling with anger issues, obviously encourage you to seek professional help, therapy, talking to a doctor. I know certain doctors will recommend medications, things like that. I know a couple of people who have dealt with anger issues in the past, and their solution was really just that they had like low testosterone levels. So really, it's just it could be a mix of different things. So seeking help in whatever way that means for you, and then don't let it eat away at you. You can talk to somebody even if it's not a therapist, friends, family, spouse, and you can always reach out to us at on any of our social media channels at diff.onpurposepod is our handle, or you can email us at differentonpurpose.pod@gmail.com. Uh, thank you for being here with me, hun. I know you're here with me. We're in separate rooms to avoid echoes and screaming microphones, but um, I appreciate you being here in Jenna's stead. And I appreciate every one of you guys for listening to us. I know it takes a good bit of time to listen to these podcasts, but if you know somebody who would benefit from listening to this story, please share it with them. If you like our content and you want to keep seeing more of it, please make sure to like and subscribe. We would love to hear from you on our social media channels. And be sure to join us next week. Jenna's going to be back, and we're going to be discussing the important topic of forgiveness. So we'll see you next time.